My name's Michael Dawson, and I work for one of the largest Chicago law firms, Harris Rhodes. I'm a corporate lawyer, and about a year ago I took on a case that would change my life forever. It was fascinating, but also morally dubious. It all began when I was visited by Genentech Pharmaceuticals executive Todd Hendrick. Genentech was one of our company's largest clients, so I had to manage things very discreetly. Todd had suspicions that his wife, Allison, a senior vice president at the business, was having an affair with Richard Olin, the CEO. Todd was convinced that Allison and Richard were working together to illegally manipulate clinical trial data to get a new drug approved ahead of schedule. He showed me the evidence he'd gathered, including dates when Allison worked late at the office, which coincided with Richard's travel schedule. He also had hotel receipts and had discovered a strange disposable phone that Al had tried to hide. It was clear that something suspicious was going on, but I advised Todd to get hard proof before accusing Allison of anything. That's when he told me he'd recorded a phone conversation between Allison and Richard. They were discussing how to falsify reports and bribe FDA officials to push the drug through faster. There was a lot of danger here, so I had to proceed with caution. We were dealing with a pharmaceutical company worth billions of dollars that was involved in illegal and corrupt activities. I couldn't bring this directly to the attention of the authorities without greatly increasing the risk to the firm and myself while keeping Todd safe. I worked behind the scenes over the next 3 months, I gradually collected more evidence. Richard made it easy for us because he often met Allison at the same hotel near the office for late-night meetings. I put together a strong dossier of photos, recordings, financial transactions, and documentation of the scheme. By this point, Todd had confronted her, and she had confessed to the affair but denied any illegal corporate activities. She begged for forgiveness and a second chance, but Todd refused. He had lost all trust in her and was too disgusted by her betrayal to even consider reconciliation. That's when Todd turned over. All the evidence finally made me take action. I knew I was stepping into a minefield, but I also knew I had to do the right thing after reviewing all the evidence Todd had gathered. It became clear to me that this was a case of corporate greed and corruption at the highest levels. Allison and Richard were willing to put countless lives at risk by manipulating clinical trial data and bribing officials, all for the sake of getting a new drug approved faster and making more money. I couldn't turn a blind eye to such a blatant disregard for the law and human life. As a lawyer, it was my job to make sure justice was done and that those responsible for these terrible crimes were held to account. But I also had to be careful. Genentech was a powerful pharmaceutical company with a lot of resources and a team of skilled lawyers. They might just bury the case and get revenge on my firm and myself if I made even the slightest mistake. So I looked over every piece of evidence Todd had given me over the next few weeks. I checked the money transactions, looked at the phone records, and so on. I checked the recordings, double-checked the travel plans and hotel receipts. I did everything I could to make sure our case was airtight and could withstand any scrutiny. At the same time, I had to keep Todd safe. Allison and Richard were dangerous individuals who wouldn't hesitate to harm anyone who threatened their scheme. I advised Todd to lay low and avoid any direct confrontation with his wife until we had a solid plan in place. As the weeks turned into months, the evidence against Allison and Richard continued to pile up. They were arrogant and had a sense of their own superiority. They thought they were invincible, which made them careless and left a trail of evidence that incriminated them. After nearly 6 months of hard work, I felt we had enough evidence to take action. However, I knew that going directly to the authorities could be risky. Genentech's legal team would undoubtedly try to bury the case or discredit our evidence with the solid documented proof in hand. I approached the U.S. Attorney's Office to report the pharmaceutical company's fraud and corruption. The federal prosecutors showed interest in the case right away. The prosecutors were interested in the case against Genentech, but if there were any leaks or gaps in the evidence, they couldn't take the chance of the prosecution trying and failing. So, we came up with a plan to get more damaging material from Allison and Richard while keeping them unaware. My legal firm was going to pose as John Inch Law Firm and conduct an internal audit. That way we could get all their computer records, emails, and other files through. We got the subpoena every year, which meant we had to prove we were financially compliant. All the transaction statements and correspondence helped our case. as they handed over the damning documentation without realizing we were building a federal criminal case, with enough overwhelming evidence from the sting to ensure convictions. The U.S. attorneys made the case public and announced the charges, which included fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and cover-up. All of these carried heavy penalties. Richard Olson and Allison Hendrick were fired immediately by the company and charged with racketeering, lying to federal investigators, and a whole load of other felonies. The huge scandal ruined Genentech's stock price and reputation. The FBI made a big public raid on the company headquarters, taking away decades of files. There were media circus-like scenes around the courthouse every time Olson and Hendrick appeared as the case against Genentech and its corrupt. It became clear that the executives had been manipulating clinical trial data for years, putting patients at risk of taking harmful drugs. They had also been bribing FDA officials and falsifying reports to get their products approved faster, all in the name of profit. The evidence we had gathered painted a picture of a company that had lost its moral compass, driven solely by greed and a disregard for human life. It was a sickening realization for me, and it only made me more determined to see justice served. As the legal proceedings continued, the pressure on Allison and Richard mounted. They were facing decades in prison and the prospect of losing everything they had worked for. Their once lavish lifestyles were crumbling around them as the weight of their crimes bore down on them. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, Allison and Richard tried to turn on each other. Each of them said the other was the mastermind behind the scheme. But the evidence we had gathered made it clear that they were both equally to blame. The trial was a media circus, with journalists and spectators packing the courtroom every day. Allison and Richard's once powerful personas were reduced to that of disgraced criminals, their reputations in tatters as the prosecution methodically laid out the case against them. It became increasingly clear that there was no way out for the two former executives. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through their desperate attempts to shift blame and avoid responsibility. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on nearly all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps as the verdict was read. Allison and Richard sat in stunned silence, their faces etched with the realization that their lives as they knew them were over. After the trial, Genentech had to deal with a lot of legal claims from investors and patients who had been affected by the company's actions. The pharmaceutical company ended up filing for bankruptcy because of the huge financial penalties and legal costs. Richard and Allison were both given lengthy prison sentences. Allison's sentence was particularly harsh because she was the one who came up with the plan. They were also ordered to pay back what they had gained illegally and to give up any assets. They ended up penniless and disgraced throughout the entire ordeal. I was focused on one thing: ensuring that justice was served. Allison and Richard's greed and willingness to put lives at risk for personal gain was unforgivable. They needed to be held accountable for their actions. I sat in the courtroom and watched them being led away in handcuffs. I felt a sense of satisfaction. We exposed a massive corporate scandal. We also sent a powerful message that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is above the law. We wanted to send a clear message that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is above the law. However, the battle was far from over. Genentech was heading for bankruptcy due to the criminal penalties and civil lawsuits, but my focus remained on bringing down Allison and Richard. Luckily, their affair provided the leverage we needed. We threatened them with decades of prison time apart, offering them a chance to testify against each other in exchange for leniency. The very things that drove their initial crimes turned them against one another. Richard was the first to crack. He was faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars and quickly flipped, selling out Allison in an attempt to avoid the longest sentence. His testimony about their affair being the catalyst for defrauding the FDA it was a real blow to Allison's case when Richard told the jury about how they'd made money from illegal stock options. He also told them about how they'd falsified data, bribed officials, and covered their tracks. It was clear that Allison had been the driving force behind the whole scheme. She'd pushed Richard to take increasingly desperate measures in the pursuit of power, wealth, and success. The jury was appalled by the evidence. The jury reached a guilty verdict on nearly all counts pretty quickly. Allison's face showed disbelief as the verdict was read. She had believed that her position and connections would shield her from the consequences of her actions. But she realized that her arrogance and hubris had been her undoing. As part of her plea bargain, she was forced to surrender everything. She was looking at over 15 years in a federal prison and losing every penny she had invested in her lavish lifestyle. It was a harsh blow, but it paled in comparison to the emotional devastation that was yet to come after utterly destroying her professional life and personal finances. Allison issued a final pathetic plea to Todd for forgiveness. Perhaps some small shred of her conscience had hoped that he might take her back, if she'd paid her debt to society. But I sat with Todd during that awful jailhouse meeting, and he just stared at her with cold contempt. "You did this to yourself, Allison," he said, his voice full of disgust. "You had everything: a loving husband, a beautiful home, financial security, a successful career. You threw it all away for some cheap fling because you could never be satisfied. You are a despicable human being." Todd turned and walked away from the prison meeting room forever, leaving Allison to face the harsh reality of the consequences she had brought upon herself in that moment. Hit her. She had made the wrong choice by cheating on her boss, and it had cost her everything: her marriage, her money, her future, and her freedom. As she began her lengthy sentence, I felt a sense of solace. I had seen time and again how one selfish act could ruin lives. Allison's sexual indiscretion enabled us to fully expose the massive fraud she had participated in. Her arrogance had blinded her to the trail of evidence she left behind, which we used to dismantle the house of lies she had built. Her tragic downfall served as a powerful legal deterrent and cautionary tale. It shows that one should be very careful about the sins they commit, as they may pay an extraordinary price far beyond what they ever expected. The aftermath of the Gentex scandal was the once mighty pharmaceutical giant was forced into bankruptcy, its assets seized and sold off to pay the huge fines and legal fees. Thousands of employees lost their jobs and their livelihoods were ruined by the greed and corruption of a few individuals at the top. It was a harsh reminder that no company, no matter how big or successful a company is, it can't avoid the consequences of unethical behavior. That's what happened to Allison and Richard. They ended up serving long prison sentences, without any of the wealth, power, or status they once had. Their luxurious lifestyles were replaced by cramped cells, and daily routines dictated by the harsh reality of Allison was left to face the consequences of her actions. She had given up so much: her marriage, her career, her freedom. She had sacrificed all of this for a short-lived affair in the pursuit of personal gain. The extent of her betrayal and the damage she had caused were almost too much to bear in the years that followed. I often think back on the Genentech case and the lessons it taught me. It was a stark reminder that the pursuit of success and wealth should never come at the expense of ethics and morality. Allison and Richard had crossed that line, and their actions had put countless lives at risk. They had shown a complete disregard for the well-being of others. They were driven by their own selfish desires and greed, but their downfall also showed how powerful the legal system can be, and how important it is to hold those in positions of power accountable for their actions. No matter how wealthy or influential they may be, no one is above the law. When I thought about the case, I felt a sense of pride I was proud of the role I played in bringing these individuals to justice. It was a long and challenging battle, but it was worth it, thanks to my efforts and those of the dedicated prosecutors and investigators. We not only exposed a massive corporate scandal, but also sent a powerful message that such blatant disregard for the law and human life would not be tolerated. The Genentech case was a real game-changer in corporate law. It was a stark reminder of the risks of unchecked greed and corruption. It showed that every decision and every action has consequences, and that those who prioritize personal gain over ethical behavior will eventually face the music. My experience just made me more determined to keep pursuing. I realized that I was driven by a sense of justice and a desire to hold the powerful to account. It wasn't just a job to me, it was a mission, a way of living. I knew there would be more challenges and injustices to address in the future, but I was prepared. I believed that, no matter how tough the situation, good would ultimately prevail.